All right,
Okay.
we're live. We are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, of a very special guest. He comes to us from Eastern Europe. I spoke to him back on December 9th, 2021. His name is Geoffery Roberts. And our earlier conversation was about an excellent book that I read titled Stalin's Wars from World War to Cold War, 1939 to 1953. And we're going to talk about a book today that just came out in February 6, 2022. Title of it is Stalin's Library, a Dictator and His Books, which I finished this morning. Really a fascinating book. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see I have a hardcover version of the book. And Mr. Roberts is Emeritus Professor of History from University College Cork. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and has been awarded numerous awards over his academic career, including a Fulbright Scholarship to Harvard and a Government of Ireland Senior Research Fellowship. He's a frequent contributor to British, Irish, and American newspapers and to popular history journals, and he has acted as a consultant for a number of television and radio documentaries. And he's written many books. Some of the titles, again, you can listen to if you listen to our earlier conversation from December. The Unholy Alliance, which is 1989. The Soviet Union, The Origins of the Second World War, 1995. The Soviet Union and World Politics, 1945-1991. That was 1999. 2002, Victory at Stalingrad, the battle that changed history. 2012, Molotov, Stalin's Cold Warrior. 2012, Stalin's General, The Life of Georgy Zhukov. And then he also did a work with a number of other authors in 2020 titled Churchill and Stalin, Comrades in Arms During the Second World War. And his website is his full name, geoffreyroberts.net. So you can contact him again there. But we're going to talk about this book today titled Stalin's Library, a Dictator and His Books. So, Mr. Geoffery Roberts, welcome back to the show. Thanks for agreeing to the interview.
Hi, good to be back.
For people who may not have heard our earlier conversation, can you have a long career. Can you kind of talk about the arc of many of the books you read and then what led you to put together this book, Stalin's Library?
Well, most of my books seem to be about Stalin, don't they? Yeah, I mean, my first book was called The Unholy Alliance. You mentioned, published in 1989, Stalin's Pact with Hitler. That was about the Nazi Soviet Pact. And then later on, I did a book called Victory at Stalingrad, that developed changed history. That was quite an important book in terms of my development of my interest in Stalin, because that's what got me interested in Stalin as a war leader, yeah, and his military role during the war. So that was an important breakthrough book from my personal point of view. Then there was Stalin's Wars, which is a study of Stalin as warlord during the Second World War and early Cold War. And then I did a book called Molotov, Stalin's Cold War, and that book was mainly about Molotov rather than Stalin. And then there was this book, Stalin's General, which was a biography of Georgy Zhukov, who was Stalin's deputy supreme commander during the Second World War, and arguably the greatest general of the Second World War. Some would say the greatest Soviet or Russian general in history. Okay, now we come to this book, and how I came to write this book was that I wanted to write a wide-ranging book about Stalin. So my previous books about or connected to Stalin had a kind of specific focus, sometimes quite a broad focus, but nevertheless a specific focus. So I was interested in the idea of doing a wide-ranging a book about Stalin, look at many different aspects of his life and career, his thinking, his character, and so on. And the opportunity arose in relation to his personal book collection, his personal library, which about 10 years ago was going to be digitalized and put online by Yale University Press. So there was an interesting source I could use to navigate my way through Stalin's life in all its different aspects, but it was also going to be conveniently online, accessible in digital form. So I'd be able to research most of this book at home in Ireland. Now it turned out that only some of the materials from Stalin's personal library were actually digitalized. Only about a third of the books that Stalin had marked in his personal library were actually became available online. The other 2/3 of the books were available, but they were in Moscow. So I had to make many trips to Moscow to look at these other books. Okay, so the whole project took a lot longer than I expected. When I took the project on 10 years ago, I thought maybe I could be finished in 2 or 3, maybe even 4 years. But it took me 10 years. Partly it took me that amount of time because of the logistics of accessing the source, because what we're talking about here is maybe 500 books that Stalin had marked in some way. He'd written it or marked in some other way. So that was the core source of the book. And most of those books I had to go to Moscow and look at in situ in the archive. And that's quite a time-consuming process. But there was another reason it took me so long to write the book, and that was because I couldn't. It took me a long time to find a way to actually write it, and the only way I could actually write it was to actually broaden the focus out from just being about Stalin's library and the particular books that he'd read and he'd marked in this library, to a much more broader exploration of Stalin as an intellectual, to a much broader intellectual portrait of Stalin, actually to write Stalin's biography. In a way, I wanted to write a wide-ranging book about Stalin, but I didn't want to write a biography because I thought to myself, well, that would take me 10 years and it would be an enormous amount of work. But as it turned out, it did take me 10 years. I had to do the enormous amount of work, research that writing a biography I'd have had to do. And in the end, I did actually, I actually ended up writing a biography. I mean, the jacket of the book, and these are not my words, these are the publisher's words. It says here, this is a remarkably original biography of Stalin told through the books he read. So that's basically
I wish the focus would come up on this book. But yeah, no, it really is interesting. And I learned a lot from it because it's a different aspect of his life. Like you have you talk to him about a bloody dictator or a warlord, but really he was much more sophisticated and literate and literary, I think, than I knew. And it started very young for him, right? Back when he was in the Caucasus in Georgia.
Yeah, look, the most important message of my book, the most important thing to understand about Stalin is that he was an intellectual. He was a man of ideas. Reading was his life. Thinking was his life. And this starts at a very early age. Stalin was a studious boy who read a lot. Who read a lot from the get-go, was a very good pupil, both in the church school he attended and in the seminary he attended. He was dedicated to reading, learning, and studying, and that dedication continued throughout the whole life. And that dedication to learning, to self-improvement, was the foundation of who Stalin was the foundation of Stalin as an intellectual. And the other point to make here is that it was Stalin's ideas, his ideology, that drove his politics, that drove his political action. Of course, when people think about Stalin, when they talk about Stalin, of course, what immediately comes to mind was that Stalin was a dictator who presided over a brutal, repressive regime. He was responsible for the deaths of millions of innocent people. And what they want to know is, well, what happened here? How is that possible? And my answer to that question is that it's possible. It happened precisely because Stalin was an intellectual, because his brutal, repressive, authoritarian politics were driven by ideas, driven by his ideology. So you can't separate Stalin, the brutal dictator, from Stalin, the intellectual. The two things go together. And what I try to show in my book is how these two things work together. And obviously I'm using this particular source of his personal library as a way of navigating through that terrain.
Right, and it is fascinating. Like, you include his marks from when he was in school. I think it was a Jesuit school or an Orthodox school, but he had very good.
Russian Orthodox Church, yeah.
Sorry, Russian Orthodox.
Stalin was a Georgian, yeah, so he was educated in Georgia, but the school it was by the Georgian branch of the Russian Orthodox Church, yeah. So that's the answer to that question. Yeah,
and his gereal last name is Geoffery, right? So,
yeah,
but you see,
yeah.
right?
Stalin, of course, was a pseudonym that he adopted about 1913 when he was an underground revolutionary in Tsarist Russia. Yeah.
Right, and he had been arrested many times, thrown in jail, had been in and out of the system, exiled.
Absolutely.
But,
yeah. And what he did when he was in jail was an excellent. The main thing he did was he read. He read books. We have lots of reports, because when he was in exile, he was kept under police surveillance. So we have lots of police reports of Stalin visiting and spending a lot of time in various public libraries. We have one particular report is where he was in exile and he absconded from the room that he was living in as part of his exile, and he left behind a whole number of books. So it's quite interesting to see what he was reading at this particular time.
But he was also kind of a teacher, so that intellectual background helped him become very important in that socialist movement, right? As a practitioner.
Yeah. Okay. So Stalin was educated in a church school in his hometown in Gory, in Georgia, and then he went to a seminary in the Georgian capital, Tbilisi. Okay, and he went to the seminary, to train as a priest. That was going to be his vocation. But what happens is that when he's in Tbilisi, when he's at the ceremony, he becomes radicalized. Yeah, he becomes a kind of rebellious student and gravitates towards the socialist movement in Russia, and eventually he drops out of the seminary and becomes a political activist, and becomes and because the socialist movement in Russia at this time is illegal, he's working underground in conditions of illegality. Now, the particular faction that he gravitated towards in the revolutionary socialist movement in Russia at this time was the Bolshevik faction, headed by Vladimir Lenin. And the thing about the Bolsheviks, about Lenin, was that this was a movement, a faction, a party that was led by intellectuals, and it was a movement that had an intellectual mission, and its intellectual mission was to enlighten the masses, to bring socialist idea to the masses, to raise people's consciousness. That's the way the Bolsheviks saw a revolution coming in Russia, a revolution that initially would overthrow Tsarist autocracy, and then would carry through a socialist revolution. And it's quite natural that Stalin, Stalin never ever refers to himself as an intellectual, but that's what he was. Yeah, that's his identity. And it's no accident that Stalin actually gravitates towards this particular part of the socialist movement, because he was an intellectual himself. It was natural that he would want to join a party of intellectuals with this intellectual mission. Now, having said that, Stalin's main role in the party wasn't that of an intellectual. He didn't perform an intellectual function. Stalin was a political activist, an agitator, an organizer, actually a revolutionary journalist. That is what he did. But all the time, all the way through, he's educating himself, he's reading, he's keeping up with matters of theory. And indeed, he actually makes some significant contributions to intellectual debate, socialist intellectual debate in Russia as well.
Yeah, one thing I didn't know is that he wrote kind of a book or something, like he was writing in that pre-World War I environment. So he was active, and I think you wrote that he had missives and letters. So he's very actively in communication, and you can kind of see that as the precursor for what happens later on in his life, right?
Well, yeah. Obviously, we're talking about pre World War One political activity, which, as you mentioned earlier, Stalin spends a lot of his time, being in prison or in exile, but all the while he's engaging intellectually. Yeah, he's thinking, he's writing, he's contributing to discussions, he's talking to people. Yeah, and that never stops. That continues through to the revolution, the 1970 revolution, and then after the revolution, throughout his whole life. That is what Stalin is reading, and he's engaging intellectually. That is that activity which really drives him forward in everything he's trying to do, he's trying to achieve.
And he was really kind of, I think that was another thing through the book that I saw, was he really was a legitimate admirer of Lenin, his books, and always that was a significant element of his library.
Absolutely. Lenin was Stalin's role model. Yeah, Lenin was an intellectual, quite important Marxist intellectual, but he was also a man of action, and that's how Stalin saw himself. He saw himself as being an intellectual, a Marxist intellectual, and being a man of action. Lenin was Stalin's role model when it came to reading, and it came to building up a big personal book collection. Lenin had a big personal book collection. Lenin actually marked his books, wrote in his books, some of them anyway, just like Stalin did. Lenin worked in his office in the Kremlin, surrounded by books, and the same was true of Stalin. Yeah, so Stalin is very much, Stalin sees himself as being a pupil, a follower of Lenin. Yeah, he in many ways he's trying to to emulate Lenin, not least as an intellectual and as a reader.
Right. And so Lenin has a stroke, is incapacitated, 1924. And that's really where Stalin moves into the next phase. But he's reading his antagonists and other theoreticians, and he has their books in the libraries.
Sure. Yeah, it's an important point that. Yeah. So Lenin is the founder of the Bolshevik Party. He's the leader. He's the Bolshevik leader of the Russian Revolution. He's the architect of the Bolshevik seizure of power. Without Lenin, there would have been no socialist revolution in Russia in 1917. And Stalin recognizes that and the indispensability of Lenin. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So Stalin very much identifies with Lenin. Lenin is by far Stalin's favorite author. There's more books by Lenin in Stalin's personal library than by anyone else. And he marks and reads in detail more books by Lenin than anyone else. Yeah. Okay, but it's not just Lenin he reads. He reads plenty of other people as well, particularly other leading members of the Bolshevik Party. Okay, but one of the things that really surprised me about my research, and this is what I discovered, was that Stalin was Lenin was Stalin's favorite author. His second favorite author, at least for a period of time in the early post-revolutionary years, was Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky, of course, who later became his great rival, who Stalin later demonized as an enemy of the revolution. And in fact, in the 1930s, he characterized Trotsky as being in cahoots with Hitler and the Nazis. And of course, it was Stalin's agents that assassinated Trotsky in Mexico in 1940. But in the early post-revolutionary years, until let's say about the mid-1920s, Stalin has a lot of time for Trotsky as an intellectual and for Trotsky's books and what's his writing. He reads his books very carefully, and in my analysis anyway, he actually gains a lot from reading of Trotsky. It's only later, in fact, Stalin himself says in about 1925, 1926, he says, until now, I've actually had a moderate position towards Trotsky. I wasn't that hostile to him. And you read Stalin's markings of Trotsky's books, and you can see that that's actually true. That wasn't just a piece of rhetoric by Stalin. So that was really interesting to me. Okay, but Stalin didn't only read his his political allies, Lenin, obviously, and Trotsky. He also read his political enemies, and he learned a lot from them as well. That was another thing that really surprised me about Stalin as a reader, his ability to pick up ideas and information from all kinds of different sources, including people who were his political opponents, people who were his sworn enemies, people whom he, politically at least, hated. Yeah, I know, he read them all, and he extracted useful information, useful ideas, useful formulation of concept from the work, which he can then use himself.
Right. So he uses these things in his speeches and things like that, and also his wide-ranging reading. And to me, I don't know if I would put him as a classicist with a capital C, but he had a very good understanding of. You said history was his favorite subject, so he
Yeah,
understood
absolutely.
Greek
Absolutely, yeah.
mythology. Can you talk about his other wide-ranging interests?
Yeah. Okay. Look. So Stalin was a Marxist. Yeah, he's a committed Marxist, committed communist. So, you know, a lot of the reading he did was about Marxism, or was by Marxists. From Stalin's point of view, Marxism had the key. Was the key to everything, the key to all knowledge. Yes, about everything. Right. So naturally, he was interested in Marxist writings on a variety of subjects. But he also read a lot of non-Marxist works as well. Okay, as a Marxist, he was particularly interested in the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, the classic writers of Marxism. Yeah, and he was interested in Marxist theory, politics, and economics. But I would actually say that he read a lot of that stuff, but actually his favorite subject was history. Yeah, and he read all kinds of different historians. In fact, his favorite historian, wasn't a Marxist, was a non-Marxist historian, a Russian historian called Yuri Vipa, who yeah. Who specialised in ancient history and the history of early Christianity. But Vipa also wrote a very famous book, a biography of Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth, one of the early Tsars who has this kind of reputation for brutality. Now, unfortunately, Stalin's copy of that particular book is missing from his library, but it's almost certain that he read it. And I'm absolutely convinced that Vipa's writings on various historical topics, including Ivan the Terrible, was actually central in shaping some very important views that Stalin came to adopt after the revolution. So so Stalin's a Marxist. Marxism, is his universe, but he reaches outside of that universe. He looks at all kinds of different writers. Yes. Particularly historians, but also memoirs, all kinds of different things, all kinds of different books you can find in his library, including many that he marked, not just Marxist stuff.
And it was interesting, like he would go to certain books when he was challenged at certain times. So post Lenin, he would read certain books that would help him in the situation. When the Hitler invades 1941, June 22nd, he starts reading other things to try to kind of learn. So he's really a lifelong learner and still developing even to up to 1953 when he passed away, right?
Yeah. Look, Stalin's a political creature. Yeah, so politics is his life. Yeah, politics drives all his interests. Yeah, so whatever political issues, concerns are at the forefront of his attention, that directs his reading. Yeah, absolutely. So in the mid 1920s, when he's involved in this, post, after Lenin's death, he's involved in this struggle with people like Trotsky, others as well, about who's going to be the new Lenin, who's going to lead the party after Lenin, who's going to be the top leader in the party. Yeah, the post-Lenin succession struggle. One of the things he does is he goes back and he reads a lot of Lenin's writings from before the revolution, from the early days of the Bolshevik Party, when it was riven by splits and there are all these different factions. And why is he doing that? Okay, he's doing that because this is Lenin, and he always wants to read what Lenin has to say. But he's also going back, reading Lenin's work, seeking kind of like ammunition and formulations, types of arguments that he can then use in the inner party struggle. Okay, so politics at the front. Same thing, jump to the 1930s. What's on his horizon in the 1930s? Well, his horizon in the 1930s, particularly after Hitler comes to power, is war. There's going to be another world war, and the Soviet Union, chances are, going to be involved in the war. So that's when he starts to get interested more in issues of military strategy, military affairs, and also in diplomacy. So again, you see that the kind of pattern is that his reading is directed towards his immediate political interests, and how his reading can actually shape and inform his political decision making. Another example, in 1936, the Soviets adopt a new constitution, a new constitution. And there's a big discussion leading up to the adoption of that constitution. And what's Stalin doing? Stalin is studying books about constitutional theory and constitutional law of other countries, of bourgeois countries, of capitalist countries. And he's reading these books, or at least one book anyway I know of, and he's marking it, marking points of interest. So, he's kind of trying, he's trying to learn from other experiences, including the experience of capitalist bourgeois countries and their constitutions, even though, of course, the Soviet constitution was in many ways very different from the types of constitutions you get in capitalist countries.
Right. No, it is fascinating. And then I think you wrote in your book, at one time his library was at 25,000 volumes, like very significant. And he had his dacha, or his country house, like he was moving it around, and that's what was kind of his study. Can you talk about the actual books that he had and how he dealt with that?
Okay. The problem with this, we don't actually know how many books he had by the time he died. 25,000 is my estimate, and this is not just books; it also includes pamphlets and periodicals as well. But that's my ballpark figure, and I explain in the book how I arrive at that ballpark figure. Okay, so what happens is that when Stalin dies, the party leadership takes the decision that they're going to turn this big dacha on the outskirts of Moscow into a Stalin museum. And this dacha, which Stalin had been built for Stalin in the mid-1930s, had a huge library room. And it also had another building which was devoted to holding stocks, stores of his books. So this dacha was the main kind of physical space of his personal library from the mid-1930s onwards. Okay, so the idea is that this dacha is going to become a Stalin museum, and had that project gone ahead, then his library, his personal library, would have been kept intact, just like Lenin's personal library had been kept intact after he died. Okay, but of course, what happens is in 1956 at the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev denounces Stalin, and the cult of his personality, and denounces the mass repressions of the Stalin era. And then after subsequent to that Congress, the party leadership takes the decision, it abandons the idea of a Stalin museum, and it issues a directive that Stalin's personal belongings, his personal stuff, including his book collection, is to be dispersed, is to be given away. In the case of the books, it's to be given away to other libraries. So that's what happens, except that a few thousand books are saved by party archivists, and they're saved by party archivists because there's a few thousand books which are identifiably belong to Stalin, and they're identified as being for Stalin by two main signifiers. One is that he wrote in these books. There's about 400 or 500 such items, or they have his ex libris stamp. In the mid-1920s, Stalin employed a librarian called Shushanika Manicharat, I call her Shusha for short. And he asked Shusha to organize his book collection for him, to sort it out for him. And one of the things she did was to devise a stamp, an ex libris stamp, which stamped his books, and it identified them as coming from Stalin's library. Now, Shusha, before she worked for Stalin as a librarian, had been Lenin's librarian. Okay, and she'd done the same thing for Lenin. She'd organized Lenin's personal book collection and devised an ex libris stamp for him, for Lenin, and then organized his books. And she did the same for Stalin. Okay. Including, this ex libris stamp, including institute a system whereby a lot of Stalin's library books were stamped and marked as belonging to him. Okay, the unfortunate thing was that in 1930, Shusha got another job, and she left the Kremlin and went to work elsewhere. And after her departure, the system that she had created of stamping accessions to Stalin's personal library, that basically, I don't just stopped happening. I'm not sure why it stopped happening. Yeah, but by the time it stopped happening, there were about 5,000 books. Yeah, which have been stamped. Yeah, and it's these 5,000 books with containing Stalin's ex libris stamps that were saved by the party archivists after the 20th Party Congress. So that's basically, so we have this remnant, a significant remnant of Stalin's personal library, about 5,500 books. 5,000 of them are unmarked by Stalin, but they have his signature, or they have his library stamp or other identifiers. And then you got about 500 items which he actually wrote in. He made marks in of various kinds. Now, there's one sort of slight complication to this story, which I'll mention here. Okay, Stalin's read a lot of fiction. There were we don't know how much literature, fictional literature there was in the library, but we can be fairly confident we're talking about thousands of items, thousands of novels, plays, short story, collection short, all kinds of things like that, right? But the thing is that Stalin generally didn't write in fictional works. There are a handful of examples in which he did, but basically he didn't do it. And nor was this stuff marked, stamped. It wasn't stamped. I'm not sure why it wasn't stamped as belonging to Stalin. I think it might be because the fiction section of the library was viewed not as Stalin's personal possession or belonging, or as being a part of his personal life. It was viewed as a family collective item. Yeah, so maybe that's why. But whatever the reason, the consequence was that when Stalin's library is dispersed after 1956, that includes virtually every item of fiction that had been in his library. So we're kind of a bit in the dark as to exactly what fiction books were in his library. Quite a lot about non-fiction, but not about fiction. So we have to reconstruct what Stalin was interested in when it comes to fictional literature from other sources, and that's why during the book I have a chapter called Stalin and Soviet literature, in which I use these sources to show the kind of fiction that Stalin was interested in and his general attitudes towards literature and towards Soviet writers and the function of Soviet writers in a socialist society.
But he was very astute. He was very literarily astute. He knew Gorky, all these other writers, and there was a Stalin Prize. So he was very much an overseer of kind of, at least maybe in his mind, of the Russian literary tradition. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, Stalin's sort of tastes in fiction were quite conventional. Yeah, he liked realist kind of literature, but realist kind of literature, realist novels, for example, which politically could be read as being either anti-capitalist or pro-socialist in some way. He called this kind of literally socialist realist literature. So it revealed reality, but it revealed that this reality was heading in the socialist direction. So again, it's the politics here. Stalin's politicization of everything. His kind of obsession with politics. It's political calculations that frame his attitude towards fiction, as well. But he's also quite liberal in some ways. Now, there are moments, particularly after the Second World War, when he's not very liberal. In fact, he's completely opposite. He's quite repressive in relation to literature and to particular writers. But in general, Stalin's attitude is that, okay, he wants Soviet writers to do socialist realist stuff, to show the value of socialism, to contribute to the socialist project, but he doesn't want to impose upon them an artistic line or a form. He wants to give them leeway to express themselves artistically. And he also says other things as well. He's in favour of complexity. Yeah, he wants characters to be realistic and to be fully, fully formed. And he's always complaining about the stereotyping in Soviet literature. And there's one really very weird thing he says in one particular discussion, and he says, we need when we're in literature, when we have characterization, we need shades of grey, we need complexity. Even when we're dealing with our enemies, this is what Stalin said, we need to show their good sides as well. We need to show what made them attractive and powerful in individuals. Because if we don't do that, we won't really expose them fully, and we won't really be able to show how these people were dealt with. And he used the example of Trotsky, whom he had assassinated just a few weeks or maybe a few months before this particular discussion. He said, look, yeah, Trotsky was our enemy. He was a bad guy, but he also had a lot of good points. And we need to show the good points of bad people. We need the bad people to be realistic characters as well as the good people. And if we do that, then that will actually make the good people look even better. That was his point. So he had some really kind of quite interesting views on literature.
Yeah, really interesting.
It's all political. Politics is always the driving force here. Yeah,
right. Like he was invested in the revolution his whole life. I mean, wouldn't you agree? He was trying to maintain something he invested in, which was the socialist revolution. And
what's driving Stalin always is defending the revolution, building socialism, defending the socialist future. That's what drove his horrific repressions and crimes. That kind of like idealistic, utopian commitment, that belief, that self-belief in what he was doing was right and was essential to actually secure the future of humanity. Right.
The inevitable future, right? It was scientific materialism.
It wasn't a utopian future. He didn't believe that socialism was the utopian dream. What Stalin believed was that socialism was the inevitable end point of history. Yeah, okay. And the question was how revolutionaries, socialists, work their way through that historical process to hasten its end and to achieve it. His kind of views about this whole question. Well, if something's inevitable, well, then we don't need to do anything about it. It's going to happen anyway. Like a lot of Marxist kind of thinking, that kind of ambivalent views. Because on the one hand, he wants to say, socialism inevitable, but he also wants to say socialism is a human creation. It's something we're going to strive for. We're going to, through political struggle, it's something we're going to achieve by human action. It's not just going to happen on its own. But you say, well, if it's inevitable, it's going to happen. So there's a certain kind of tension and ambiguity in Stalin's thinking here. But that was something he shared with Marxists in general.
And one of the interesting things that I learned from your book is how much of an editor he was. He was constantly editing things from Pravda and his legacy. Really, he was very much involved. And one book I remember is The Short Course of History in the Communist Party. Very much involved in making sure his image was secure, how he wanted it portrayed. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, okay. So Stalin was, as a young man, he was a political activist, but mainly what he was a political journalist. What he was mainly doing, he was writing articles, he was writing pamphlets, he was writing leaflets, he was editing. Yeah, he was including, editing newspapers. Yeah, he was a radical political journalist. So that's the foundation of his political activity. So he was, from a very early age, engaged in the activity of editing, and that carries through, after the revolution. Stalin edits everything that comes across his desk. There are thousands upon thousands of documents where you can see Stalin making editorial corrections. Correcting them, altering them, amending them, adding them, all kinds of different ways. But he also gets involved in some significant book editing projects as well, particularly in the 1930s and 1940s. And again, there's a chapter in my book that's called Editor-in-Chief of the USSR. It looks at Stalin as editor. I mean, the opening line of that chapter was that, if there was one thing that Stalin loved as much as reading, it was editing. And I think that's true. Okay, and you mentioned one particular book that he was heavily involved in the editing of. In fact, he was so heavily involved as the editor of this particular book that he was actually its author or its co-author. Okay, the book he mentioned was the short course history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So this is a history of the party that was published in 1938. And the book arose from Stalin's dissatisfaction about existing histories of the party. Yeah, he thought there was a need for a better history, a history that would educate party members, not the massive ordinary party members, but the party cadres. Yes, the key activists and personnel. It would teach people to about the history of the party, and it would also educate people theoretically. 1930s, Stalin was very concerned about, and again shows him as an intellectual, and ideas been important. He's very concerned about the intellectual level, the theoretical level of key party members. He thinks it's very low, so he thinks he needs there's a text which could be used as the basis for their education, and that's the text he contributes to significantly. In fact, one particular section of that text, which is on dialectical and historical materialism, it's his text. That part of the book is not just something he edited. That's him. He wrote that. Now, the interesting thing about this process, okay, so the text is drafted by some party officials, and Stalin then edits their text and edits it like in quite radical ways. So as I said, he's one of the authors of this book. He's not just the editor of that book. Okay, but the party officials, okay, so we're talking about the mid-1930s here. Okay, and this is when the cult of Stalin's personality is really kind of like rising up. It's not quite at its height. It reaches its height after the Second World War, but it's at a pretty high pitch. So, of course, the party officials, who themselves are kind of like, what's the word? They're adherents of the Stalin cult. They believe in the cult themselves. They feature very heavily in their draft of the book, Stalin's role, not just after the revolution, when he was actually leader of the Soviet Union after Lenin's death, but Stalin's role in the party before the revolution. Okay, and what Stalin did when he was editing, he went through it, and particularly the early sections of the book, which dealt with the early history of the Bolshevik Party from its foundation in the early 20th century up until the revolution. He went through that section and basically he cut virtually all the stuff that referred to himself. All the material about himself. So the only important figure that's left in the text after Stalin has edited it, has excised all this material about himself, is Lenin. So Lenin is the dominating figure of the first section of the short history, and it's Stalin's doing, and explaining what he's doing to party officials. What he says, look, we want to do two things here. One is we want to get people not to love me. We don't want them to get to love the party. Yeah, don't love Big Brother, love the party as an institution. We want them committed to the party as an institution, not just to any particular individual, even when that individual is me. And then we also need to educate them in Marxist theory, in ideas. Yeah, we need to bring them ideas. So one of the other things that the party officials who drafted this textbook initially, is that they had a lot of personal heroic stories about Bolshevik heroes who'd fought for the revolution, died for the revolution, have been in prison, and that kind of thing. And Stalin cut all that stuff out. He depersonalized the history, and he explained why he did that. He said, "No, we want a history of the ideas of the party, That's the most important thing. Not that, you know, so and so did this, did that, was in prison or in exile. No. We need a history of the party which emphasises ideas. We need to arm our members for the ideological struggle. And of course, at this time that this whole thing is happening, you know, Stalin thinks he's involved in a very profound ideological struggle with internal and external enemies, including, of course, Trotsky. Trotsky was one of the people he has in his mind. So, you know, in order to, you know, win the ideological struggle within the party, within the country, and also internationally, then the members of the party have to be armed intellectually and educated with the appropriate ideas.
Right, and that even happened post-war. He's editing, even after the war, these other books. It's really remarkable that he was guiding and shaping these very important books that were being read through the Soviet Union.
One of the things that, so Stalin was the Soviet leader. Stalin was the dictator. So it was always obvious that he was the dominant figure, the central figure, the pivotal figure in the whole system. But we didn't really know how important he was, how pivotal he was, how involved he was until the Soviet Union collapsed and communism collapsed, and we were able to get into the archives. And then we go into the archives, and believe me, it is just amazing the number of pies he has his fingers in, the amount of paperwork he deals with, the number of decisions, including lots of small decisions that he deals with. It is quite an incredible performance. And while he's doing all this, he's also spending a lot of time reading and thinking and marking his books and drawing his own conclusions. Whatever Stalin's like, what's the word I'm looking for? Faults, crimes, all of that kind of stuff. You have to be impressed by his performance in this respect, by his performance as a political leader.
Right, the stamina, the intellectual rigor, the solidity, really is an incredible figure.
Yeah, and that, of course, people around him saw this, they experienced it firsthand. Yeah, that's why it wasn't just because he had power, and it wasn't just because he had this cult of personality. It's also because of the way he performed. That's what bowled people over, as well as all the other things as well. Yeah?
Right, but you have to look at it all. The revolution, overcoming the revolution, the defense of Sardinia, which became St. Petersburg, all the way through fighting among the people, his own party, external forces, World War II, really just a incredible.
Yeah, I mean, the Soviet Union, actually all the way through until Stalin's death, actually, and even after, is a system in crisis, in upheaval, in transformation. A system with huge amounts of political violence embedded in it. That's the system that Stalin's presiding over, trying to control, trying to direct, trying to achieve certain goals at it. And the thing about Stalin is this: is that he's persistent. Yeah, he never ever wavers. In front of the problems. This is quite an important point. I think that Stephen Kotkin wrote this huge kind of biography of Stalin, which I think is a very good piece of work. I've written reviews of the first two volumes, very laudatory reviews. I think I have some things to offer that he doesn't have in his books, but people can judge that for himself. But he does make this point: is that the thing that really cemented Stalin's power position and overawed the people he worked with, including other top Bolshevik leaders, was the role that he played during the process of collectivizing Soviet agriculture from the late 1920s onwards, right? Which is a very, very violent process of expropriation and enforcing the party and the state's power over defenders in order to sort of take control of the Soviet countryside, so that the state could actually feed the cities and the urban population, which were engaged in this drive for industrialization and modernization. And the thing about, and it's a very problematic crisis. There's all kinds of things that go wrong with it, but what Kotkin says is that what really impressed people was Stalin's persistence he saw it through. He saw it through. His persistence, and that's characteristic of Stalin in lots of respects. He sees things through. He doesn't waver in the face of the problems that he's confronted. He finds a way either through or around, usually with a battering ram, to actually get through the problems. So Stalin's persistence, crucial thing.
Incredible. Even just taking World War II as a little part of its one chapter of his life, just incredible that they could turn that around and end up in Berlin.
Yeah. Would you know, I wrote a whole book about that called Stalin's Wars. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
We talked about that a little in our last conversation too.
But of course, even during the war, he's finding time to do some reading, to do some editing.
Geoffery, we're at 50 minutes. Do you have time to take some questions from the audience?
Sorry for going on for so long.
Yeah. No, it's okay. It's okay.
I've been living with this book in my head for the last 10 years, and now it's all coming out. You know what I mean?
Right. No, it's really fascinating. It's a different angle on a very important person. Some people you don't see that, but you have the resources and all these books to actually put that together.
Listen, I'm trying to give a balance portrayal. That's really important. People understand that. Yeah, this is about Stalin as an intellectual, Stalin as a reader, his library, and all that kind of very interesting stuff. But in no way is it kind of like downplaying, or denying other aspects of what Stalin was up to during his life. The very first line in the book is, this is an exploration of the intellectual life of one of Hitler's bloodiest dictators. Yeah, I have a whole section which is called Stalin's Terror. Which charts the Great Terror in the 1930s and Stalin's role in that process. I'm not trying to deny in any way that Stalin was also a brutal, ruthless, repressive, dictator. When I say he's an intellectual, he's an idealist, he's a utopian. Yeah. That's very important to understand. Okay, questions would be great.
Orfeo asked, and he says, I'm not clear on the Jesuit Orthodox connection, except in terms of a fairly virulent aversion. Is there something else? And I think it's like, how did he come from studying in a Christian environment and then turning to socialism?
Well, the Jesuits were Catholics. Stalin was educated by the Orthodox Church, which, of course, were split from the Catholic Church in I don't know when it was, sometime around 1000, 1200 BC. I can't remember what it exactly. So they were a different completely different strand of Christianity, the Eastern Church, which actually came from Byzantium, and the Russian Orthodox Church was a branch of the Eastern Orthodox Church. So that was Stalin's religious upbringing, and it seems to be clear that as a young boy, he was very religious. He was a believer. His mother was a believer, was very devout, and Stalin was the same. Okay, but particularly when he goes to the seminary in Tbilisi, he comes in contact with radical students, radical ideas. There's a lot of student protests have been going on. There's a lot of stuff going on in Georgia generally. The Georgian nationalism is on the rise, and growing hostility to Russian domination of Georgia, and also Marxist ideas are beginning to spread in Tsarist Russia, and groups of Marxists are forming all over Tsarist Russia, including in Georgia, in Stalin's part of the Tsarist Empire, which is in Georgia. Okay, so that's the context in basically which he drops out of the church. He turns his back on the church. Now, some people argue that Stalin retained some religious belief and some kind of affiliation or affection to the Orthodox Church, which had educated him in the seminary. I don't think there's any truth in that at all. I have a whole section in the book on that. Stalin, when he became a socialist and a Marxist, he also became an atheist, and that never changed throughout his life. In fact, when he was leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin pursued a very repressive policy towards the church, highly repressive policy towards the church in Russia, not just the Orthodox Church, but other branches of Christianity and also other religions. Now, during the Second World War, there's a partial reconciliation with the Russian Orthodox Church as part of the ongoing Soviet war effort, but that was a matter of political expediency rather than expressing, any affiliation that Stalin might have had with the Orthodox Church or with Christianity.
Gotcha. And here's a question that you could answer. It may not be in this book, but was Stalin involved with Helena Blavatsky, who I think was Russian, in other occult activities while insisting on atheism for his subjects? Have you ever heard anything about that? Did you ever come across any belief in occultism? He didn't have anything like that in communism, right? It was just
No.
Marxism.
There are a lot of weird and wonderful ideas floating around about Stalin, including in relation to religious questions and cultism. But and I spent a long time, a lot of my time, like tracking down this stuff, chasing this stuff to try and verify it or to try and see whether there's any truth on it. And generally, there's no evidence for it. As far as I can see, there's no truth in that or any of that kind of stuff.
Another question is, what were his general trends of his interest, especially outside of Marxism? Did you notice anything in that library that showed an outside trend? You talked about his fiction books.
Well, okay. In terms of fiction, he was a devotee of the classics of world literature. Shakespeare, Goethe, Victor Hugo, Alexander Dumas, Kipling, all that kind of stuff like that. So these weren't Marxist. So that was one non-Marxist interest, an interest which he shared with Lenin and Marx. Both Lenin and Marx and Stalin saw this kind of literature as having a progressive role because it revealed certain realities about historical development and about capitalism and about class struggle. Yeah, that's one thing. Yeah, the other thing. I kind of mentioned earlier, history. Yeah, I mean that a lot of his interests in history were, non-Marxist interests. In fact, in relation to history, he came to adopt what you might think to be a very non-Marxist approach to Russian history, because eventually he came to the view that the Tsars have been autocrats, they've been oppressors, exploiters of the people and so on, but they'd also created this powerful Russian state, which acted as a protector of the people who live within it, and this was a legacy that the Bolsheviks had gained control of as a result of their revolution. And the Bolsheviks had a historic duty to protect that legacy. And in protecting that legacy, they would protect the population of Soviet Russia as it then was, but also they would protect the project of socialism as well. So what happens in the 1930s under Stalin is that there's a kind of identification of Soviet communism as being not just revolutionary and Marxist and socialist, but also as being patriotic. The defenders of the Soviet Union as a multinational state, the heir to Great Russia, and that comes from non-Marxist sources. As I mentioned earlier, Robert Vipa is a major influence in Stalin's shift of thinking in that respect. That's one example. I suppose another example would be in terms of military theory, strategy, and tactics. A lot of Stalin's thinking and reading and interest in that area, were to do with non-Marxist contributions to that. So that'd be a third example. Okay.
Excellent. Okay. And then another question is from Illustrate Life. What was the most surprising book Dr. Roberts found in his library?
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Okay. Yeah. As to answer that, well, the first interesting book, surprising book that I found in Stalin's little library actually was a book by Robert Vipa, and it was a history of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Right, very interesting. And this particular book was marked. Every single page of it was marked. Yeah, it had sentences underlined, paragraphs underlined, lines in the margin. This is a 300-page book, and every book is marked. And I was very excited when I saw this book. Right, so Stalin is interested in the history of the Roman Empire. Yeah, maybe that's his kind of like historical reference point and model, not the history of Tsarism and Russia, but maybe that's it. So I was very excited about that. So that was really, I thought that was a huge find. I was really surprised to find that. I was very excited about it. The problem is, eventually I had to conclude that, okay, yeah, this book was in his library. Yuri Vipel was his favorite historian, I think. And I'm sure he must have read or looked at this book, but all these marks I found in it weren't Stalin's marks. They're not his marks. This was a second-hand book, and it was someone else's marks. Okay, so that's one example. The second example I give, and this is Stalin, is that it was a book published in 1945, and it's a study of the constitutional law of different countries, of different capitalist countries. So it's a book that goes through the different constitutions in different countries. And Stalin read this book, and he obviously had a great interest in the details of, different types of constitutions, the balance of power, the separation of the different branches of the state, different kinds of elections, presidential systems, parliamentary systems, all that kind of thing. That really surprised me, was the level of detail of his interest in that particular topic. Okay. I can see the question on the screen there. Do you want me to answer that? Can you hear me?
I had it muted. Sorry. I'll repeat that again. Was Stalin more interested in Marxism or liberating Russia? Sorry.
Well, both. He didn't see that as being a different interest. They're the same interest, yeah? He saw Marxism as being the liberation of Russia, yeah? Marxism, was the way to liberate Russia, and the Marxist ideals of socialism were the way to make Russia, or the Soviet Union as it became, greater. There's no distinction between, in Stalin's mind. Stalin sees himself as being, a Marxist revolutionary and also an internationalist. Really important point to mention here. Stalin was an internationalist, so he wasn't just interested in Russia. He was interested in other countries as well, the history of other countries. In fact, foreigners who visited him were amazed, very often amazed by the amount of knowledge that he had of their countries. And he got that knowledge not because he was being briefed by officials who were writing documents, no, from his own reading. So Stalin's interest in the history of many different countries in many different parts of the world. He's an internationalist. Okay, but so Stalin sees himself, as an internationalist, as a revolutionary, as a Marxist, a socialist, a communist, and all that. But he also sees himself as a patriot of the Soviet system. And this is one of the concepts he develops. It's the concept of Soviet patriotism. What is a Soviet patriot? A Soviet patriot is someone who gives their loyalty to the Soviet system. And the Soviet system, the socialist aspect of the Soviet system, protects their welfare. The patriotic aspect of the system protects them from foreigners, from foreign invasion, from foreign oppression.
Gotcha. And your section, you talk about him writing. He would write humbug or yes or da or all kinds of things in his book. You called, I think the Russian word is pometsky. But what do you think? Pometsky. What do you think Stalin would have written on this book? Stalin's.
Yeah. That's a very good question. Okay, well, I would have liked to think that Stalin would have written on the front cover of the book, the one you can see one I can see on the screen in my hand. He'd have written on the front cover about his favorite annotation, which was NB, Note Bene, NB. Yeah. This is an interesting book. This is an important book. This is a book that I need to read. You need to read. But I suspect that what he would have actually written on the front of the book would have been his second favorite annotation, right? Which was ha ha. I think he'd have written ha ha. So Roberts thinks he can get inside my head by reading through my library books. Ha ha. I think that's what he would have written likely to have read
figure, just an incredibly complex person. So this is the book kind of gets more insight into how well read he was and how intelligent. And where's the best place for people to get Stalin's library? It's available now. There's an audiobook too, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's an audio book. Yeah, and it's not too expensive either. Yeah, I mean, obviously you can buy online. Although when I was looking at a certain well-known online supplier of various books and goods, I noticed that it said that they were out of stock and there was some delay in providing copies. So go to an online provider who can supply you a copy immediately, or go to a bookshop. I mean, all big good bookshops. I'm sure that you'll be able to find copies of the book there. Yeah, and I'm sure in due course there'll be a paperback edition. So if you want to save some money and wait until that, or go to your local library, get a library to order it for you. Yeah,
there you
absolutely.
go.
Yeah,
there you go. And the audiobook's available now. There's a hardcover. And if people want to reach out to you, your website's the best place, right? GeoffreyRoberts.net.
Well, you could, okay. Look at my website, and you can see there's lots of stuff by me, writings by me on the website, all kinds of things. Yeah, but it also has my email address on the website, how to contact me. And sure, if people want to contact me if they have questions about the book, about whatever, anything at all, just drop me a line on the email. That's the best way to contact me, and I'll do the best to reply to people's questions and queries.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for your time. You're clearly an expert. You know so much about Stalin and that history. I'm really delighted that you took the time to talk about this. Your book, Stalin's Library, A Dictator and His Books, published 2022 by Geoffery Roberts. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, stay there.